Good morning, class. I've finished reading your initial discussion posts and your introductions, so thank you to all of you who have um, posted already. You have full credit for the class so far if you've posted. I wasn't too concerned about length for posts, for discussion posts, or asking questions, but just remember as you go into the more class related directly to our text that when you do your discussion posts, to make your initial post at least 500 words long, um, and then to ask two discussion questions from folks in class to stimulate discussion. And that's going to be one of the challenges of being in an online environment. And just think of it like um, uh, uh, it's an environment, especially when we're not meeting like all together on Zoom or something like that. Um, there's a lot of absence, right? So we only get to know what you about you, what you present out to us, and then the rest can be kind of vague. So try and give us more. Definitely push yourself to write more. You don't have to limit yourself to 500 words, but try and do at least that much. You can do a lot of thinking out loud. And this question, the initial question of what literature is, will be an ongoing thing for us, right? And a lot of people had some really good aspects to their definitions of literature just as we're going in. There are a couple things I want to respond to in this short video, just to get us thinking, and also just to remind us from the outset, this is an intro class. I'm going to get pretty deep in lectures, and my lectures are there for you to learn from and to gain insight from, and to challenge your thinking at times, and at the same time, I know I'm going to go way into depth into some things, but it is just an intro level class. So if you're confused, if you have questions, ask me questions, right? Because I've thought about this stuff a great deal, and there's usually reasons for the ways that I present things, the manner in which I present things. And so one of the distinctions, and I think that we all need to sort of think about from the outset, is kind of think about our current cultural context in the United States. And we're going through a national discussion right now around Black Lives Matter, for example. But that slogan and that has become very powerful is speaking to much deeper issues, right? About race and inclusion, about the history of racism, and how that continues to play out in people's lives, whether or not they think of themselves as racist. And so, especially for folks who look like me, like folks who are white men, for example, and I will speak at times, generally from my experience as a white man, and that's why I'm identifying myself in that particular way. But for many folks who look like me, uh, uh, they are dealing on some sort of spectrum. It's not one day that you become woke, although we talk about woke culture, for example. Dealing with the necessity to confront privilege, and privileges that they did not necessarily choose or ask for, but nevertheless that they have. And what that has meant historically is that many people have been marginalized. Many people's voices have not been heard, and they're starting to be heard. And I wouldn't just say just starting, like, anybody who knows anything about this knows that the protests, the movements that feed into Black Lives Matter, for example, are in many cases centuries long. And that, for example, if I'm going to speak just in terms of African Americans' perspective, um, the struggle has been intergenerational, right? There's nothing new. There's nothing. exceptional about this moment, except that it's become a time, I think, perhaps under COVID, that because people are at home and they're witnessing this stuff more, and they're not just tied up in daily activities, they're able to see the disparity and the inequity that exists in our culture. And so that word culture, even that word culture, is going to be really, really loaded for us and take some unpacking. And that's where I'm going in terms of my lectures, and definitely in terms of my own definition of literature. And so one of these, if you look at your posts or your peers' posts, one of the things that has come up, even in these initial discussions, is how closely our concepts of literature are tied to a notion of value, right? So if there's a classic, right, like many of you mentioned things like classic literature, that there's something that kind of rises above the rest of what is produced. Some comparisons of genres, you said, um, and we should think about, like, well, where do genres come from? That's one way to think of this. And because, if I go back to the current national discussion, because there's been a lot of marginalization and a lot of exclusion, historically, uh, a lot of times what people value as culture, or as capital L literature, for example, is laden within their own sort of ideological perceptions uh, of what are the things that we value in society, or what things of value do we take for granted, for example, in society. And so my definition of literature, as you know, if you've watched my first, the kind of long video, where I'm unpacking a definition and doing a lot of work there, and following this psychologist, Jacques Lacan, mid 20th century figure, um, uh, who's dealing with, very much dealing with a kind of human development, a little bit of evolution in that lecture. Um, One of the things that I say about literature and the study of literature is that it is a way that we track social desire over time, right? That's one of the ways. Now, you don't have to buy all of my definition of literature, right? I'm just giving you something to bounce off of. And there are different ways, definitely, to do it, and there would be different ways to explain it if I didn't use Lacan, for example, or a psychoanalytic perspective. But that's what we're going to start with. The idea that literature, the study of literature, allows us to track human desire over time. That word human is loaded for me as well, because only certain people have had access to what um, gets perceived culturally, in the United States especially, as fully human. So people have been treated, historically, sometimes as less than human, for example, through slavery. Definitely Native American and indigenous peoples have been treated in ways that are less than human, and that they need to gain some sort of access to capital C civilization, right? So civilization is a very, very loaded word for me, as well. And traditionally, English literature classes do start with the Greeks, but of course, the Greeks are not English. That's not, it's a completely different culture. There are ways that people talk about Western civilization, and that's something to think about, that concept of the West, and what is happening to that concept in the world that we live in right now. And when we look back at Euripides, and Anne Carson's translation of an ancient Greek play for next week, we really want to, keep that in mind. That Yeah, there are some traditional things that I'm doing with this course, but there are also, like, it's a very current translation, and so think about the ways that the Bacchae might relate to current things that we're seeing in terms of social unrest in our own society. I think that there are some really good connections that you might want to make in discussion posts for next week. think about Aristotle's concepts, um, peripeteia, for example, reversals, hamartia. Look up those terms if you want to, out in places outside of the text, and outside of my lectures. And realize that if we're looking at ancient Greek culture, there's going to be a lot of stuff that like is assumed knowledge for the people who are reading the Greeks. And so one of them might be the story of Dionysus itself. Like Dionysus is a character like it's like if we were gonna like write the tragedy of Darth Vader in our culture, right? Generally, people know who Darth Vader is, and maybe they don't know the whole story, and maybe more Star Wars episodes come out and they give us nuances on the generation of the family. It's like, oh, well, he was the father of these people, but there are these other parents, or Luke Skywalker in the first, or like the third episode, but the first episode of Star Wars made, for example, is not, doesn't realize that he's the, son of Darth Vader, doesn't realize that he has a twin sister, so there's a twinning element, which is very ancient. And all of this kind of corresponds back to an idea of mythology, right? And some people, so we're reading our play for next week, deals very much with mythology. So in the Greek culture, for example, to say Dionysus and that he's the son of this woman named Semele, and Semele, generally the audience would know that Semele was seduced, at least. That's one way of putting it. Perhaps we could think about it in terms of rape as well. And what would it mean to be raped by a god like Zeus? But and Zeus has, of course, his partner Hera, who's a goddess partner, but Zeus likes to seduce mortal women like Semele, and the story of Semele that out of jealousy, Zeus's quote wife, Zeus's Hera, is jealous that Zeus has taken an interest in this mortal woman, and so appears to the mortal woman Semele. This is Dionysus's mom, in a appears as another woman and says, you know what, like, if this guy that you're seeing really is Zeus, really is a god, he should you should ask him to show his full self to you, and his full power, his true form to you. Otherwise, because it just might be an imposter pretending that he's Zeus. And so Semele insists on the next time she sees Zeus, she insists on him showing her and his full form, right? Which of course destroys the mortal woman, right? So they're like making love, and he's gotten her pregnant and shows her himself in his true form. It kills Semele, and Zeus thus takes the baby out of the womb and puts it in his thigh, and then the baby grows in his thigh and then bursts out of his thigh later on when he is fully developed, and that's Dionysus. And so that's why sometimes people will say Dionysus means that this is a twice born god. There are other words that his name mean as well. But generally speaking, so that's some weird stuff already, but that's kind of like stuff that people who would just go to the play, they're like, oh, this is going to be a play about Dionysus. And everybody knows these kind of backstories. And that's part of we could call it the fabric or the text. Like a text means web. And that's a good thing to think of in definitions of literature, that if we're looking at texts and textuality itself, that we can think of it as web, right? And I'm talking to you through another web. And so there are ways to think about textuality that expand beyond literature in terms of written words on the page, like linear alphabetically, as I say in my lecture. And this opens up ways to think about film, TV, as literature itself as well. And so it gives us a greater capacity for thinking of what we study. And if I come back just at the intro in the introduction of the class, just remember, um, I'm introducing you to literature, but in terms also the study of literature at the professional level, right? And historically, in intro to literature classes, it's like if people are just like, oh, I'm going to go to intro to literature class and I'm going to become educated and I'm going to like become sophisticated and I'm going to know culture better, right? As if culture is this thing that you can become really adept in, and that you can use to like move up, like to transcend. There's a kind of vertical movement that happens in the ways that people have treated culture in the West, and tied it to ideas of education and class movement, for example. If you're born like my parents didn't go to college. I'm a first generation student, like some of you. And so it was like reading books and stuff like that. That was not something that for my own family, that was my family was really big on. So my family, like my parents, didn't really like read Shakespeare or any of this stuff, and so from the outside, it's like they're like, well, what's the use in that? It's just like one book is just like as much as good as another. And then there's also this kind of aspiration that like if we read Shakespeare, if we read the classics, we somehow become like kind of enlightened bodies of knowledge. Somewhere around here, I think I've got a bookmark, and like is yeah. So here's a bookmark from the tattered cover downtown, and it says, "Books are humanity in print." That's like they've always got little quotes and stuff on them. I want to think about that notion of humanity and humanism, which is a movement that comes out of the Renaissance, which is the time a little bit before. It's what's informing where Shakespeare's coming from. This idea that humans, through human knowledge, can build and cultivate themselves and learn through science by studying nature, or the book of nature as they called it in the early modern period, that we can learn how our world works, right? And that kind of movement, that kind of those values are still around us. But like if you think about just like the middle of the 20th century, the horrors, some of you are studying the Third Reich. I noticed from some historians. I don't have everybody's names in my head quite yet. And we look at things that happened in the middle of the 20th century, massive amounts of human devastation, through atomic bombs being dropped, through the Shoah, the Jewish Shoah, or the catastrophe, sometimes called the Holocaust. But I use the Jewish term Shoah for really specific reasons. And so humans do crazy stuff with their knowledge and with their science that doesn't always end up being good for us. In fact, now we're in a kind of dilemma where our human knowledge has caused great environmental devastation, for example. And we're worried about whether or not the species, not just our species, but other species on the planet, are going to be able to continue if we keep doing things the way that we're doing them. So there's a lot of of stuff that we're thinking about, and we got to really unpack how notions of humanity, traditional notions of humanity, might sort of play into and this is an interesting thing about Greek tragedy and Greek myths and Greek culture, is that the gods are playing a role, active roles in people's lives. So that's a pretty big difference for most people in our current culture. Although, I mean, we'll talk a lot about religion, and you can think about prayer warriors, and so I do think that there are people who still interact in ways. It's not like something of the past that people believe, or engage with forces, entities, beings that might be called gods, deities, things like this, throughout the world. But in terms of our broader sort of current secular culture in the United States, um, uh, the kinds of interaction where Zeus is coming down and getting it on with mortal women, we don't see that broadly in our culture. we see other things though. And so to think about myth, I'll say a lot about myth next week, but what I want to sort of begin with is that myth is not something of the past. That's the thing. That's why I used the Darth Vader example. You can think about it in terms of like current mythological figures. Like if you're into hip hop, like who are Tupac, Shakur, and Biggie Smalls, and why are they important in relationship to each other, and how does their relationship inform later hip hop music? How does their relationship inform the work of someone? Um, uh, I don't know. Like think about Kanye, not so much Kanye. Perhaps Jay Z. We could think about that. There's this kind of movement in rap music after the Tupac and Biggie incident. That rap music becomes very much about entrepreneurs, and it becomes kind of like the businessman who's also got like some kind of like a street background, and very much like someone like Jay-Z is this kind of figure, and he's a powerful cultural figure in our culture, whether or not you listen to hip hop. Beyonce as well, right? Super super powerful people. If anybody has listened to Kendrick Lamar's record, To Pimp a Butterfly, Kendrick Lamar might be called rap music, but he says he's a writer, and I would say that Kendrick Lamar is doing literature. For example, in fact, I've taught To Pimp a Butterfly in literature classes before, but we're not doing it this summer. If you listen to that record, at the end of the record, there's a long interview that Kendrick Lamar has edited together through interviews with Tupac Shakur. And so we know Tupac, at least most people think he's dead, although you could say maybe some people, maybe there's some conspiracy. I generally think that he died. Um, so Kendrick Lamar is having this that sets it up so that he's having this conversation with a dead person, right? And we could think of that as a ghost, for example. And ghosts are really really present in African American literature and African American culture. So if anyone's ever read Beloved by Toni Morrison, there's the dealing with a ghost and a ghost who ages. And so those types of qualities, thinking about spiritual entities, are really, we can think about current literature in that particular way as well. And I want to think about that in terms of myth as being the stories that surround our culture and that we're very very familiar with. And many of you will not be familiar with Dionysus or Zeus or Hera or ancient Greek mythology. We offer whole classes on ancient Greek mythology in the English department. That's not going to be the subject of our class this semester, but it's certainly interesting stuff. And so if you see people's names, you might just look up even on Wikipedia if you're finding something unfamiliar in the Bacchae, even though it's a very readable text. You can pop around, and it's really easy to just start getting a sense of like the relationships of some of the mythological characters, like Zeus, for example. I will not be telling those types of like long stories, like where does Zeus come from and who's his father and who's his father. So much there might be a little bit of that in lectures next week, but this isn't a class in myth. We are in the drama genre of class, and this genre that we're reading for next week, which is Greek tragedy, does have a lot of mythological elements in it. And so I will talk about myth specifically in lecture next week, and I'll talk about sacrifice, and I'll talk about Dionysus. And there's a lot of stuff I'm going to be weaving together. It'll be quite heady in some ways. And so just to let you know that's where we're going. And if it gets heady, and like don't worry, like your midterm isn't going to be like a test over like the fascinating ways that like psychoanalysis and literary or religious studies, like all of these all of these things fix. This is an intro course, but I'm going to give you an intro to the profession and an intro to why I think it's important to be studying this. And so I don't mean this in a really crass sense of saying like the profession, and that we should only think about literature in terms of people's professions, or getting money or something like that. But that's a way for us to think about the question of value. in our culture, and to step back from an unexamined way of thinking about how culture works. I think that that's really important when we're thinking about issues of diversity, inclusivity, um, the national discussions that we're having right now, and the questions around values, right? Like, what do we value as a culture, and not just assuming that these things are the things that we value. So we might read famous works like Greek tragedy. We might read Shakespeare, right? Who's like very, very important in the history of literature, not just in the English language, right? He's still very, very important in lots of ways. And I'm having us read Shakespeare, for example, in this class because of his importance to the study of and the genre of literature. But I'm not presenting Shakespeare, for example, as like oh, everybody worship Shakespeare, or like I'm not presenting him as necessarily the gold standard, and he often gets treated that way. I understand that. But it is not about like this class is not about me saying like this is what is good and now take this and go on in your life. No, what I'm doing with this class is giving us ways to into thinking about what literature is, because as many of you pointed out in your discussions, it's an open-ended system. We won't be reading Chinese literature in this class. We're reading language, generally stuff that is, or at least accessing it in English, although I assigned one Spanish novelist or Mexican novelist, right, who's written in Spanish, and one Greek play. And there's a couple of other things in translation that we'll see in the short stories and poems section. So the Intro to Literature class is about giving you guys the tools to think about literature, and to carry on with a whole lifelong study of literature. We're not going to be able to cover a whole grand swath of human culture in the next 8 weeks, right? But I can give you some like really interesting ways to sort of think about this stuff, that allow us to kind of question unassumed values, that often get mapped onto literature, and then like what happens when like a whole, it's like, well, you've got like all of these like so-called great books, and they end up kind of over time uh, uh, melding into an apparatus of texts, that say like these are the important texts to know, but all sorts of other voices have been excluded over time. And it's because of the power relationships of the people who are having discussions around literature itself, and the history of the academy, and the history of the study of what it is. And we need to challenge that in literary studies right now, whether or not you're English majors or literature majors at all. We need to challenge that. I think that literature is a good way to challenge our assumptions and ideas. It's about compassion, as I say in my other lecture, like being able to put ourselves in the other person's shoes. And so I think that literature can be quite useful in trying times that like we're having right now, in terms of social unrest. It's a good go-to source, but it can be a good go-to source if you approach it in a particular way. If you're just assuming that there's like this one kind of closed body of works, and particularly like works that have only been written by one person of one kind of gender or one kind of ethnicity over time, then we start falling into traps. Okay, so these are just my initial thoughts. I'm just gonna end here because I can talk about this stuff all day. But thank you for posting your initial discussion. I will give little videos like this in response to your discussions collectively. If you have specific questions, please shoot me emails. Show up to virtual office hours on Monday from 1 to 2. I just hang out and some of you popped in on Monday this week. That was great. You've got the 2 other lectures to watch this week. Be on the lookout for the unveiling of some lectures on Dionysus, Sacrifice and Mythology, showing up next week. If you have finished the Bacchae already and you want to keep going, the next thing to read is Macbeth, and we also have a film version of Macbeth. But I want you to try and post. This is like, not next week. We're just doing Bacchae next week, right? But if you're pushing on with class, do your discussion post, your first discussion post on Shakespeare before watching the film, and the next one after the film if you're just like bored and you want to get on with class. So my video lectures will show up early next week. I think your discussion posts are due Tuesday night, but follow the dates in Blackboard. I think, but I think it's all of that stuff is cleared up now. All right, thank you. Have a good weekend. I hope that you find Anne Carson's translation of Bacchae intriguing, and that you're able to make some connections between what Aristotle was seeing in terms of an analysis of the genre of tragedy. I'll say a lot more about tragedy next week, but have a good weekend. Take care.